The vocations in Dragon's Dogma 2 are vastly different, not only from each other, but from the Dragon's Dogma 1 vocations. So today we're going to rank all 10 vocations from worst to best, and then in the comments you can tell me how wrong my opinion is. Let's go! Let me know your rankings in the comments down below. I'm going to rank these from worst to best and give you my reasoning, talk a little bit about both as an arisen and a pawn vocation. And I will say here up front that every single vocation is pretty damn good. Some are obviously better than others, but they're all quite unique and you can definitely have success with every single one of them. So if I put your favorite vocation at 10, don't sue me. And speaking of number 10, the Trickster is number 10. Now, I really wanted to like the Trickster. I honestly did, but it's not versatile enough to really be fun to play, to put it bluntly. Like, the idea of manipulating enemies to have them attack each other, jump off cliffs, and, you know, it sounds great in principle, and it definitely looks great in the short marketing videos that they release, but realistically, at least half the time, you're not next to those ledges and cliffs that allow you to use those parts of the kit, and essentially, other than that, you're basically operating as a tank that forces enemies to attack your simulacrum, your illusion, and then otherwise you have one buffing skill to buff your allies' damage, and then you kind of just stand there. And you know, like, the downside to that is that these fights go for a really long time because the pawn AI, while it being quite good, don't get me wrong, it's not as good as the player themselves focusing on weak points and enemy mechanics. And the taunt is just so easy to get off once your simulacrum is active and you've either latched it to an enemy with latching effigy or cast suffocating shroud to like have everything in a massive AoE essentially just attack your illusion. And then once you've buffed your allies, you kind of don't have to do anything until the enemy dies. And in some fights, you know, that's fine. Like, it's a fun class to play around with, especially when you're in those open spaces and you can manipulate the enemies and throw them off edges and like move things around. But then in those tighter quarters or against boss fights, you're sort of just like waiting for the fight to end, which is really disappointing. It's a really unique vocation, and I really like the concept here that they have tried to pull off. It's just missing a couple of things in my opinion. Like, it needs some other skills, like, you know, like at least like a single heal or another buff for pawns, or even just any kind of damage. Like, I really think the Trickster, literally all it is missing is some sort of AoE like poison skill that you can use, very similar to like suffocating shroud, that will just like poison enemies and do a damage over time effect on them, right? That's basically all the class is missing. It's just one way to do damage, right? To give you something to do other than just make sure that your simulacrum doesn't die, right? That's the main issue here, I think, in my opinion, right? Like, I know that there are people that are massive Trickster stands, and I can totally see why this class is fun to play, but just on its own in a vacuum, it's not for me, and it just doesn't have enough going for it to be one of the best vocations in Dragon's Dogma 2. Number 9 on this list is the Warrior. This is the most controversial opinion I will make in this video, I think. But for me to rank this, like, something has to go here, and I think it is the Warrior for a couple of reasons. Now, some things I like about the Warrior: I love the high damage numbers you can get from its massive weapons. There is something cool about playing these sort of vocations and classes in games where you've got giant weapons and you smack things with them, and like they have that massive knockback potential and the damage it can do. But then conversely, as the Warrior, the animations are very slow, and it requires quite a high skill ceiling to be played properly because of being able to combo those animations together with that perfect timing to lower the animation cycles when you're using it. Now, partly because of that as well, and having those big weapons and the big armor, their carry weight is very high, which is a massive problem in Dragon's Dogma 2, that the carry weight is so low across everything. And the class does take a while to get going, especially once you've got the Dwarven smithing style and you get that knockback power and the knockback resistance, so that you can essentially stand there and tank everything and just throw enemies around with all that knockback power. It does see a lot of success and is quite a good vocation in that way, and if that's what you're going for, but they are lacking some of the utility that a lot of the other vocations have, especially compared to, say, the Fighter, for example. But it also comes into play a little bit when you think about the Pawn vocation as essentially like pawns being a warrior. They're, in a way, they're a little bit of a worse fighter, as often, like, I've noticed when I've had warrior pawns that they miss their attacks so much because the enemies move quite fast and they're like loading up this massive swing, and the enemy has moved by the time they've actually triggered it. Now, like, that's okay if you're using the warrior as sort of a supplement to a fighter and having them taunt with bellow and that sort of thing, but the overall kit here isn't as flexible as the fighter or as defensive as the fighter as a pawn vocation, and it's definitely got its limitations, and the overall damage output that it doesn't outweigh these limitations in my opinion, which is why it ends up 9 on this list. Next is number 8, and that is the archer. Now I quite like the archer. The archer can do a pretty insane amount of damage with its basic attacks, right? The default light attack is pretty average, but when you steady shot, it's actually fantastic because you can snipe enemies, you can always hit weak points, and that is like one of the critical parts about this game, is being able to hit weak points or deal just an absolutely insane amount of damage with basic skills. So there is some really solid skills here, right? From like exploding shot that does great damage, it also knocks back enemies, to deathly arrow that's also quite good here with some good burst potential options as well, from barrage shot to torrent shot. There is flexibility in the type of arrow types you can use, but conversely, that flexibility doesn't come with any utility otherwise, right? Like, you don't have any ways that you can support your allies, or even as a pawn vocation, you do typically want your pawns to have some sort of utility skills, and here as a pawn, they don't really have any options here, and the pawns don't use like steady shot all the time to always hit the weak points either, so it is lacking some of that utility in that aspect as well. It's definitely a solid range DPS option, with one of the best augments like being just the archer's endurance to increase max stamina, but like I think that skill utility that they are missing here is why it ends up a little bit lower on this list compared to some of the other pawn vocations and player vocations, because you've got things like the mage having healing and buffing, the thief having stealing and ensnaring, and the fighter having taunting, and all those benefits outweigh just the potential of having a raw damage dealing vocation like this for the player and the pawn. Number 7, the fighter. The fighter's role in combat is essentially to play as a tank, right? You'll be in that melee range. You're the only class that can have a shield, which is one of the best parts about that kit, is the defensive aspects of it. Conversely, though, that does lead to some of the difficulties the fighter does have, is because you're going to be holding your shield up all the time. Stamina management is quite tough if you are playing as a fighter yourself, but it is a fun vocation to get your hands on. Now, I believe, in my personal opinion, that it is a little bit stronger than the warrior because it does have a bit more flexibility in terms of its attack animations, its defensive capabilities, like, you know, not only shield jump from taunting, but also having augments like metal for physical defense and Thu for extra carry weight, which is beneficial for pawns across the board as well as yourself. Like, there's a little bit more flexibility in the fighter kit, I feel, than in the warrior, and being able to play as a defensive role. And if I was trying to pick between, say, a fighter pawn or a warrior pawn, I'll typically lean fighter because of those benefits. And I also like their weapon flexibility, which is the same for the warrior too, right? You've got slash and strike weapons, but the fighter has some really quality weapons in the late game, like a bunch of them that just like appear out of nowhere. So it's really good in that aspect as well. Number 6 is the warfarer. Now, this is a tricky one. The freedom of this vocation is what makes it really beneficial and what makes it stand out, but it's also what is sort of its main limitation, right? As being able to use any weapon whilst not incurring all that carry weight as well for every single weapon, and being able to wear any single armor and have every single core skill and basically any augment you want, right? Like, and all the weapon skills. There is so much flexibility with the warfarer that it's almost its main criticism is that it's hard to find what really works. Now, because of that, like, you can find those combinations as well that actually work for you, and even things that are just fun to play, right? Like, I think the key thing with the warfare, and if you're wondering about this vocation, is to just pick vocations that you think are fun, combine them together, pick skills you like, and just have fun, right? This game isn't that hard that you need to have like a perfect min-max build all the time. Like, I think the warfare is just fun in that way, but the main criticism here is that because you've got all of that freedom, it is hard to find things that really work. And for the most part, you're only going to have access to 3 skills, because that 4th skill is being used by rearmament just so that you can simply switch between those weapons, right? And you're leaning on all the other vocations' best parts about their kit, or for the most part, the best parts about their kit, which means the warfare doesn't necessarily stand on its own, right? Like, you know, if you're thinking, oh, you know, what basic attack or light attacks you're going to use, you're really worrying about what other vocation you're using, which means the warfare isn't the main part of what makes that kit good, if that makes sense, right? So I really like the freedom here, and you can really make some insane combinations like the Sorcerer's Flare with the Magic Archer's basic attack for just that insane exploding burst potential. Even using something like the Trickster's like pawn damage buff like we touched on earlier, and then actually being able to attack with another vocation as your active vocation then, right? So you can remove some of the limitations of the other vocations, but it doesn't stand on its own because it's relying on all the other vocations and you're actual having leveled them up, having those skills, etc. So that's why it sort of fits somewhere in the middle of this pack. Number 5 is the Mystic Spear Hand. Now, it pains me a lot to put my favorite vocation so low on this list, but truth be told, it's definitely not the best in the game for a couple of reasons. Now, it's a really fun vocation. It's very stylish and it looks cool, and it comes with one of the best aspects being that you can do both strength and magic damage, which is really, really beneficial. Now, it does have some limitations in terms of its armor resistances for such a melee-focused class, though you can use the Mirror Shield as one of the best protection skills in the game, but it does lack some of that high damage potential that some of the other vocations have, and some of those supporting skills other than Mirror Shield that these other ones have as well. Now, I think its lack of skill variety and flexibility is one of the downsides here. Now, it does have plenty of skills, right, but they really boil down to either movement skills like being able to dash forward or dash upwards, or ranged spells like being able to throw stuff at enemies, which aren't really any different to the basic kit of just the basic skills and the redoubted bolt, which you're pretty much going to lean into heavily anyway. It's not until you get the Maester skill Wild Fury that you can deal an insane amount of damage with this vocation, and the part of that downside is that the damage potential of the Mystic Spear Hand heavily relies on its Maester skill, and it's one of the hardest Maester skills to get in the game. Fun fact, Nick, our editor, was actually in charge of doing the Mystic Spear Hand vocation guide, and he couldn't beat the Drake to unlock the skill. All right, don't tell him I told you guys, even though he's editing this video.
You're mocking me, aren't you?
But it's funny because you can get this vocation so early, and then it takes forever to get that Maester skill, and it just doesn't feel great without it. But it's interesting because the Maester skills for some of these vocations, you just get them like immediately as getting the vocation for some, especially some of these later ones. So it just feels really weird that this one has such a obtuse Maester skill in order to actually get compared to some of the others. But anyway, moving on to number 4. That is the Sorcerer. Now, this top 4, I really struggled with getting the order that I was happy with. So I'm really interested to see what you think about this. But so the Sorcerer lands at number 4 because they have such a high amount of damage potential, right? Now, Meteoron, summoning like that meteor shower, just deals so much damage. It's absolutely insane. And like, obviously you can only use a skill outside because they're meteors falling from the earth. And if that's the case, you can just use the Flare skill, which explodes for even more insane damage as well. The only downside here is that they do lack some support skills, but their damage capabilities outweigh that in my opinion. Plus the utility of Levitate is definitely not to be understated either. Just being able to deal with some of the platforming in Dragon's Dogma 2, like being able to move around. There are some platforming challenges here, but then there's a lot of chests and stuff that are, you know, hidden up on ledges, etc. And being able to use Levitate just as a good way to get around those situations is really beneficial, and it can't be understated how good that is. Plus there is some great augments here that are beneficial for other classes too, like Asparity to increase the likelihood of applying debilitations, Catalyst to increase your damage dealt when exploiting a target's elemental weakness, as well as Sagacity to increase your magic damage as well. Like, there's a lot of value in a Sorcerer, even though they are lacking some of the support aspects of, you know, the Mage, for example, or some of the other vocations. I did also think it's weird that the Sorcerer gets 2 Maester skills than the other vocations. Technically, I guess the Thief, but like it's really only 1. But it's also weird how in-depth this quest line is for both the Mage and the Sorcerer's Maester skills. Well, a lot of the other vocations either don't have a quest, or they just give you the vocation Maester skill, or they're very obtuse, like the Spearhand one. I just thought that was a weird detail, that sometimes it feels like some of these vocations have a lot more love put into them than some of the other ones. And even though the Sorcerer is missing a lot of skills from the original Dragon's Dogma 1, it's still absolutely an incredible vocation. The Thief is our number 3 here. Now, the Thief is an interesting one, right? You've got the Helm Splitter attack, which is your main burst damage that you'll deal on bosses and everything. Now, I was originally sleeping on the Thief, right? Especially Helm Splitter. Did not think that it was as good as it was. It absolutely is incredible. So it's really good for large enemies enemies because you can hit all of that attack on them. They also have some surprisingly large amount of utility that I didn't realize at first either, right? You've got the steal skill, pilfer or plunder, that essentially can take items off all of the enemies, and having this on a pawn is exceptionally good. Like, you'll often get wake stones and fairy stones just randomly because they've stolen it from enemies. Like, I found that to be just a really valuable part of having a thief pawn. And we've also got ensnare, which is a fantastic CC ability to rip enemies out of the air or knock larger enemies off balance. Like, there's a lot of versatility in that, plus a great basic attack for fast attack combos and solid damage, plus they can dodge, which, you know, is very unique to this kit as well. So there's a lot here that's like, what's not to love? Like, they have a very versatile kit both as a player because of the amount of damage you can do with Helm Splitter, focusing on those weak points because they can hold on to enemies for much longer than the other vocations. Plus, as a pawn, you've got all of that utility from the steal skill to ensnare, and then just having the damage skills that they also have, plus their maester skills, which is also quite good. So it's really a high damage, high utility vocation that is good for both the player and the arisen. Number 2 is the mage. Now, this is the best support pawn available in the game, hands down, and they have a ton of very valuable skills, and there's a lot to love here. So you've got things like the support skills like Palladium that just prevent damage from coming to all of you and your pawns. Like, can't go wrong there. You've got great healing skills. You can also imbue your weapons with all sorts of elemental damage and focus on those weaknesses. Plus, you've got the ability to do holy damage with Empyrean, which is quite unique as well, which, you know, is only good at night. Like, it's very situational, but it makes this kit a little bit unique as well. And the maester skill here, Celestial PN, like, you can't go wrong here with having like essentially unlimited stamina and the damage reduction it does and everything as well. Like, it's absolutely one of the best vocations, and the reason it sits here as well at so high is because it's also one of the best as a pawn vocation because of all that flexibility, right? Like, I think every party should have a mage in them, whether you're playing it yourself or a pawn is playing it, and it's one of the only vocations where I pay so much attention to those 4 skills that it uses, right? Like, if I am either having my pawn use it or picking one off the rift, like, I want to make sure they've got the right skills that I actually want to use, and because there's so many that are really valuable to have, whereas a lot of the other vocations, it's sort of like, you know, 3 or 4 of them are really good and you're like, as long as I've got them, it's fine. Whereas a mage, it's like, you know, like, it's so much trade-off between which ones you're using because they're also valuable to have in your party, which is why I think it's really good. And it's, you know, it's also got levitate just like the sorcerer, so you've got that freedom as well. Even your pawns can use levitate. Like, that's something that happened to me a couple of times, that my pawn was able to get me chest because it was a mage. Like, very, very valuable vocation to have in your party regardless. Number 1 is the only vocation left. You may have guessed it. It's the magic archer. Now, this is, in my opinion, the best basic attack in the game because it heat seeks enemies and you can always hit weak points with it, which makes it more powerful than the archer in that way. It also has some really great supportive skills like Life Taker Arrow to suck life from enemies into one of your allies, as well as Bartizan to prevent some damage. It's also got some really great damage skills, like Martyr's Bolt might be the most OP maester skill in the game, followed closely by Meteoron. Essentially, even though you lose some of your max health here, the amount of damage it does at such a fast rate is like really hard to sneeze at. It also has some great knockback potential with things like Arctic Bolt, so you can knock the larger enemies off balance and knock them down to then follow up. It's also quite versatile with its augments here too, right? Like, you've got the ability to recover some stamina when delivering killing blows. You've got the ability to buff your pawns with physical defense and magic defense like sustainment, or their strength and magic on the pawns from ascendancy. There's flexibility in this kit, both in terms of a supportive role and a damage role for the Arisen, that I think this is one that sees a lot of success for the Arisen, even though it is an Arisen specific vocation compared to something like the Mage. Both of these, like, I think are almost equal number 1, right? Like, the Mage is absolutely the best pawn vocation, and in my opinion, this is one of the best Arisen vocations, and that's why it lands at number 1. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, guys. Thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.